Greetings, everyone. Recording is in progress. This is Andrew Williams Jr., and this is our monthly show with the retired General Arnold Gordon-Bray, and the architect, Michael Rendler. Thank you all for joining us. Today is August the 1st, 2022, and I'm pleased and excited to bring this to you live streaming on Facebook, the AHIABGA network. You can also find it as the Facebook group Encounter Think Tank, because that is actually where we started 5 years ago. But General Bray, thank you so much for joining us. We only see your photo and not your picture. But if you could be so kind as to share your video and introduce yourself to the audience, and then introduce Mr. Michael Rendler, who has a presentation for us. General Bray, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much. I was just speaking with Lady Alicia, and she was letting us know that she is currently moving her daughter into college up in San Francisco. So I'm going to apologize for not having her eloquence and brilliance to assist us in navigating some territory. But she did give us the things that she wanted to ensure we continue to address and then emphasize. And there are two that she says there are things in her will that she wants to get out of us to talk about today. A lot of talk. We just shifted from the month of June and July, and what people have historically on their mind associated with that, which was the Juneteenth period that we talked about before. And she wants me to hit on that again, and it kind of goes to the second part, which is a lot of what's in the news, which is truth. And we'll get to those in a few minutes. But before I get too far into the game, I know there's another discussion that's out there right now. Michael Rendler and I are doing some other work with some teammates across the country talking about housing and housing effects and trying to do holistic change, which is going to always be a thematic that we're going to address. Because, you know, when we talk about the past is only a platform to leap off to the future. So anything that we talk about here, if it sounds like we're staying in the past, fix us, ask the question, challenge us, and say, how is that relevant to today? How is that relevant to the people? Because this whole discussion, every discussion that I ever have, even if I'm going to the latrine, it's really about what's next. I'm clearing my bladder, for lack of a better word, so that I can do something else more productive going forward. But everything is about the future. And sometimes if you don't fully understand the past, then you make mistakes about the future. You make mistakes about the things you believe. And that links to truth. So again, I'm going to pause here for a second, introduce my teammate, and in truth, I call him a peer mentor because, first of all, he's brilliant. He's rooted in science, which I was not. I'm an artist, innovator, and dreamer, and a unabashed believer in the ideas that are behind our Constitution. And those are the two pieces that link me to hope and vision. And but this gentleman is the one that also, again, roots me in realities. So with that said, Michael Rendler, please tell me what's on your mind, and then we'll try to merge all these ideas and thoughts together, please.
Yeah, thank you, General Bray. Well, as you said, we've been working with a group across the United States to try to look at, you know, how this holistic vision with this platform narrative will emerge. And so kind of really comprehensively, what we're seeing is an alignment of multiple agencies at the federal level now labeled the whole of government. And this whole of government was started in Los Angeles 25 years ago with an idea of saying we need a federal enterprise architecture. This federal enterprise architecture is also in the federal government. And we've watched it grow, we've watched it mature, and now we're seeing it manifest with multiple efforts to point directly to our at-risk, underserved, disenfranchised community. And so what we've been trying to think through is, how do we actually bring those resources into these communities for the optimum systemic results? And I believe the core concept is self-empowerment. And we're trying to think through, what does that look like? How do you do that? Is there a framework? Is there a concept? And the concept we're working towards is a concept we developed with UCLA and the Nobel family, called Vcap, Virtual Community Action Planning. We've demonstrated it in Kansas City. We're working with the political officials in Los Angeles. We're working with the political officials in Kansas City. We spent almost a year working with Stafford, Virginia. So we know that this is something where each of these municipalities have to come to grips with their whole of governance. And so I have a little slide deck here, or it's actually a notepad that I'm going to scroll through. I'm going to share and scroll through and try to get everybody to start to recognize this idea, today's theme, which I'm going to label agile manufacturing. Agile manufacturing means, just like food supply, products being localized, being produced in local areas. And what this is going to allow to happen as it emerges is you're going to get this huge innovation opportunity. And so we've called these innovation labs, we call these innovation centers, and we've called them STEM labs. We've called them by different names. But in essence, Andrew said at the beginning, we have an example here in Los Angeles that we've been working out of at Los Angeles Trade Technical College in their architecture program. This idea of laboratory and best practice, which the government is asking for a data-driven design system, and how do you put a data-driven design system in place. So I'm going to share my screen and bring this document up. I think I can do this. Yeah, so here's the document. Let me move this over here. It's a pretty extensive document, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. And I clipped out some pieces to the document that we can talk about today. Well, let me move this over a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. And what it is, it's around this idea of energy and energy systems. And the reason that this energy system is, energy is at the core of our Justice 40 conversation, our infrastructure bill. And now it's part of this new bill that's in the Senate. It's a little controversial on the Inflationary Protection Act. And that is also a discussion around energy. And so the energy systems that we're going to be talking about today a little bit, we want to bring those concepts and those ideas directly into these STEM centers and allow the youth using VCAP in their neighborhoods to look at their neighborhoods as a science project called community science. And community science narrative is, how can they actually start to conduct what we call ground truthing this behavior, these ideas, to lead them into STEM career pathways. And one of our strategic partners in this conversation is a group called VAG, Veterans Affinity Group, that General Bray has been working with. So they will be facilitating some of the leadership in this idea within these inner city areas across the United States. And we're preparing a proposal to the to the EDA, Economic Development Administration, to help them see the picture to get to this concept right here. And this concept, if you can't read it, says an evidence-based policy act associated with the Office of Management and Budget and in support of the presidential management agenda's strategic goal of leveraging data as a strategic asset. The Department of Commerce designated the following officials. And so this premise that you can get from this site is the core concept of our Vcap, that we want to use spatial information technology as a process for us to look at our neighborhoods and understand where's the best place to put these types of interventions. And most of the time, we're thinking about social services, which is very important. But in this particular aspect, we're talking about the largest employer in the United States, the manufacturing industry. And as I move down through this, I move between government sites. And so this is a government site from the Department of Energy. And the reason I want to point that out is bringing the Department of Transportation, the EDA, the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, the EPA, all into one space to make data-driven design decisions. We have to have an interoperable data model. And to have democracy, we need to be able to have our community knowledgeable enough so that then they can process that. And we've demonstrated this in Kansas City with the mayor's office, with the Steam Village and their Red Tails project. And now they're working through a next generation submittal as part of this Vcap implementation to transition a strategic piece of property with the city into an innovation center. And then the actual Red Tails are working with the community to carry this message of what it means to build a net zero facility, a facility that doesn't use any energy more than it actually creates. So it's basically the word inert, meaning it's not harming the environment. And that idea is a core idea where the heating and cooling aspects are going to then start to look at this relationship of engineering, science, liberal arts, trade, vocational education. And these are coming out of the Department of Energy to realign career pathways. So 3 years ago, we presented, our studio presented to Watts on their Strategic Growth Council project, Transformative Climate Community Grant, that there's a new integration that's happening in this sector. And it's so interesting to us that now we see the exact same wheel imagery at the federal level. And so we've seen a pattern where projects and perception is launched as case studies, experiment, if you will, in California, and now it's rolling across the United States. So we're hopeful, and this, you can go and get more information on this career pathway. And as you zoom into this, you start to realize that now they're looking at specific sectors and what those sectors are and how those sectors have specific job opportunities and relationships. So these documents associated to career pathways and specific disciplines are now able to be tracked with the data model. And you can see here, and the biggest one here, it's a very small word right here, but it says infrastructure. And so the infrastructure that I'm talking about is this infrastructure in light manufacturing that will build this next generation environment. And that next generation environment is going to have to be carbon neutral or as close to carbon neutral. And to do that, it has to be what's called locally sourced. And so this whole paradigm of looking at energy and how energy is utilized has been studied in depth by our team in Los Angeles through the largest sustainable building program in the United States, where our studio actually developed an example of how to use students to develop a data-driven design interface. That interface, which is part of the screen background I have, that interface is then a way to measure and support this. So as we move down, we come to understand that now they're calling this smart manufacturing. Again, we submitted a paper. We called it Smart Citizen. It was for our re-entry population in Los Angeles. Smart Citizen was under the guides of who's going to support the data back end to run the smart city. So we have smart cities, we have smart buildings, and now we're talking about smart manufacturing. And this gets into what's called the Internet of Things. And why I stick to this narrative as opposed to talking more specifically about social programs and social transformation is because part of the requirement of the environmental defense, the Economic Development Administration is that we're looking at high paid jobs, and we're looking at jobs that can support families, and we're looking at jobs into the future. And that's where the general started the conversation today. These are about jobs into the future. So now you have your big software companies at the table. And what needs to happen through our small group is we need to really sort out what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like. And what you're going to see pretty quickly by using this data narrative is everybody is going to be at the table. And we're going to get to what General Bray is explaining, this transformational inclusive narrative. So this is coming out of UCLA, this thing that they call deep smart manufacturing. This gets into your Internet of Things. This gets into all the electronic devices. And these electronic devices all have to be programmed. And so this then gets to the first robotics group. This gets to sensory control for air quality monitoring. This gets to plants that have factory plants that have to process water, called water treatment plants. And all of these devices, whether they're micro devices like a chipset or a macro system like a water treatment plant, need a workforce participatory to be able to operate them. And so a group that we're working with here in Los Angeles, Jobs Create Peace, Mr. Brad Carson, working with the reentry population. The conversation is, can we assess our community? Can we design our community? Can we construct our community? So I walked you through the construction concepts, which are called offsite construction or manufacturing. And then are we going to be able to operate them? Do we have the 1099 candidates? Do we have the W-2 candidates? Are they trained? Are they ready? And so out of saying all of this, we want to get to this thing called pay to learn. And that means that students, by the time they finish high school, have already had an internship in an office in the profession of their career pathway. And they've been compensated to participate in this emerging model. And that is what's called linked learning. And linked learning is a nationwide effort so that we can make sure that they're work ready and both in attitude and motivation and intelligence. And we've proved that this is a really legitimate thing, because we're not going to be able to build this transformation model without that thinking. And so how do we bring the thinking into the community, to the neighborhood? And then how does the neighborhood get their voice there? And we feel that if you look at this educational program, what people are asked to look at, these are complicated concepts, but they're all associated to this curriculum that we put together and have been using in Kansas City, and we're going to start up in Las Vegas. We've been using it in Watts. We used it in Los Angeles, called Vcap, Virtual Community Action Planning, which Andrew's network has done a whole bunch of work around. So that I think is pretty much concluding our presentation. Again, this note with all the links in it that I kind of scrolled through here, I will put in the chat. Andrew can put it on the website, and we will then be able to share this information on how this is developing. And you can see, I found this really interesting because in my class on Saturday with the red tails, there was a language piece. And so these are the language that are constantly used across all of these disciplines. And so this is a academic white paper looking at systems, data, information, integration, models, standards, viewpoints, manufacturing, devices. I probably used every one of these words in my little talk here this morning, but the one that we talked the most about, and this is the most powerful one, are concepts. And these students have really powerful concepts because they've lived the life, and they have a lot to bring into the conversation. So I'm going to leave it with that, and thank you for your time. Kind of walking you through this narrative, smart citizens that operate smart manufacturing inside of smart buildings in smart cities to reach our sustainability objectives of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Two sides of the same coin. One side, social justice, the other side, environmental justice. There's no other way to get there.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, Michael?
Yes, we hear you fine, Andrew. Thank you.
Wonderful. I seem to have a little echo, but we do have a guest, Sir Bailey. You've made some interesting chats. So could you introduce yourself, Sir Bailey?
Y'all already know how honored and excited I would be to introduce myself. Good to see you again, General Gordon-Bray. You shared with the Free LA Youth Justice Coalition class a few, I think it was January, we had you into a class, and young people still excited, super excited about meeting with Mr. Rendler in Justice 40. Like I said in the chat, we're starting professional development. Super excited here at Youth Build about the model that Youth Build started in the 1970s with Dorothy Stoneman saying that we can take these dilapidated crack houses with student effort and turn them into learning centers. And that power, working with Habitat for Humanity, working with just the beauty, working with the beauty of love and service. You know, at Youth Build is the competencies that we teach off of are success, leadership, collaboration. How does love and healing, love and support, love and care, support and healing, social consciousness and action, how are these competencies so relevant in building the world that we have? I'm excited to have shared at the USC Rosier Math Camp how STEM with relationship, real relationship in arts creates a stream where we are flowing. Again, thank you, Ambassador, for the invitation and email. Thank you for allowing me to share here. And God bless you. God bless the work. Pick up, Rendler. Justice 40 is going down.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much, Sir Bailey. I do also want to share my screen briefly. This is Andrew Williams Jr. And my role here is as a coordinator, but also as a facilitator in connecting together the dots for what we're faced with in the urban communities. I'm in Los Angeles. Our 5 Points Youth Foundation, founded 20 years after civil unrest, just a few blocks away from where the Rodney King riots kicked off. We are in a position to be the ones to connect the dots locally to global activities. I believe the new urban agenda could be that very method that we use. This is also where the Department of Housing and Urban Development is our interface between the United States and the rest of the world. So I won't go into too much detail here, but I'll turn it back over to General Bray to facilitate and to follow up the comments by Sir Bailey and the comments by Michael Rendler, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And there is can you still see me? Hello?
We see your photo again, not you. We were seeing you, but now we see your photo.
Not sure what happened here. I thought I had us. Please, can you still hear me?
Yep, we hear you great.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what happened to my photo or why I'm not up.
Okay, you clicked out. You went to mute.
How about now? Can you?
Yep, we're good now.
Well, I'll do two things, and if the photo pops back up, there is a connection, so you can always see that. That person, for those who, whenever you see that photo of me, it's my personal reminder that I'm part of legacy and history. And I think I've told you this before, because I think history lets you know you're rooted. The person that I'm with, that is General Charles McGee, one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. He passed at 102 years old. That photo was roughly 12 years ago, 10 years ago, excuse me. Actually less than 10 years ago, at the opening of the African American Museum. And before that time, he and I had met believe it or not, at a football game with some athletes, and we spoke and found out that we were fraternity brothers, Alpha Phi Alpha, and we had had a conversation, and we talked about requirements and demands for us to be linked. So now I will try to put all this kind of in perspective, and then I'm going to kind of walk myself forward to some of the things that you've heard from both Michael and from Sir Bailey, as well as introducing one of the ideas that was questioned, that was brought out by Lady Alicia, who's not here. She's talked about truth. In 1865, we know that we were an enslaved people. Most of the people of color were enslaved, and that was part of the design of color, to basically separate us from the owners of property and properties in the United States. Does that matter? It does, because here's what happens now. Today, up to now, we still have people who think of each other, and I said each other, I'm talking about people who are not of color and people who are of color, and we've divided each other. We even use terms like good hair, straight hair, light skinned, etc., and we use those to differentiate who we are. We've got to get past that, but that is one of the remnants of what happened in color. A lot of us also like to talk about and think about, well, after Juneteenth, it ended. Well, that's not, first of all, Juneteenth was just a recognition of Texas. I'm gonna say this again, a recognition of Texas that the Emancipation had freed slaves in the South. Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the South. It was not until 1865 that a law that was passed in January of 1865 was ratified and brought to fruition 7 months after the war ended, the Civil War ended, when Georgia signed off as the 27th state out of 35. You know that old class, ABC, 3/4 have to ratify the law that slavery ended. Well, many will say, well, yeah, but it was over because the war was over and Juneteenth was it. No, not true, because the states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware were still slave states until, I say again, they were still slave states until Georgia signed off and allowed what had already passed in January to become a law. And if you believe that it was just a piece of paper, you're kidding yourself. The second thing that's most important to understand is that until the Voting Rights Act of 1865, 2 generations ago, just 25 years ago generation, that we really and truly start to be able to legally expose our demands and our requirements. So that's important to kind of understand that. So now those remnants are there, and that's what these new rules are about. Because I'm a South Carolinian, and it's not until it was not until 1966 that we started integrating schools. And so some of the other schools were not even integrated to even later than that. If you ever saw the movie, Remember the Titans, you can see where how much that was 1971 in Northern Virginia, that they were fighting for that kind of freedom. What did it matter? What did it mean to us? First of all, the books that we're using were outdated and old. And so there was a gap of intellectual training. Have we had some outstanding examples of individuals who have met the standard even with old books? Absolutely. As long as there have been people, there have been those who have been able to step outside of whatever societal framework that there is and become examples of sheer brilliance that would not be contained based upon whatever the framework was. But that never gets that 95% of people who are inside the box. As a result of integration, many other people broke away, and you never got the mix of dollars and education and interaction that's essential of what occurs inside public education. That's why we have to have all these other kinds of programs that we're looking at right now. That's why the remnants of the culture we are going to have to attack for at least another couple generations. I'm going to say that again. We're going to have to attack it for at least another couple of generations, because even those skin complexions are starting to blend. The culture of what was in the past will remain until the N-word no longer exists, or it is used so crossways that it never infers a single particular group of people. That is the approach of some. I will tell you right now, the N-word is not part of my vocabulary, because I think about people like the Emmett Tills, the folks I've known growing up in South Carolina. Very often those are the last words that they heard used on them. So no matter how colloquial it may become, I will never accept it in my household or in my presence. I just ignore it, because it never will get cool for me. But what is going to get cool for me is the fact that we are in a period right now where I recognize some of the percentages of who we are. Specifically, there are people who are underserved, underrepresented, undervalued, and disenfranchised. Some of them just because of who they used to have in their family chain. Others have done some things that would have in past times been a slap on the wrist, but it has caused them now to be disenfranchised by society. They've been incarcerated. And so we've got to figure out how do we bring those who don't really have a character flaw back into society. They're still part of that undervalued and disenfranchised. And by the way, this isn't just because it's a great idea. It is also part of the economy, because there are brilliant minds that have unfortunately had the value system snatched from them. They're also a market for people to bring back into for the good ideas that they have stored inside of them. And in order to do that, what you heard Michael Rendler talk about, the great details of being able to go in those specific communities to raise up the places like LA, some of the communities in Kansas City on the northwest side, or in places like Las Vegas in the old historic district of the west side, or southeast Houston, Gary, Indiana's, the places where there's huge swaths of people that were formerly considered Black, that they can create the label they want to, but the culture's there. And you heard Michael Rendler also start to talk about part of being able to change it generationally is through wealth development. Well, first of all, there's got to be the literacy to go with that. In fact, there are 4 pillars that everything that we talk about, everything that we do is associated with making the cultural change of the mind and the community. Very specifically, one is character and leader development. That's really where the Veterans Affinity Group nestles itself. We think that's a foundational piece, but it is not the superhighway to change. The superhighway to change is through education. And the mechanism of education is science, technology, engineering, arts for innovation, and math. That's the superhighway. Imbuing students with how to see their environment, utilizing a tool inside the education called virtual community action planning. That means they're involved in the design of their communities, understanding how the environment works, understanding the interactions of the details of how people live, and then giving them the skills not only to see the problem, but the tools to know how to make the changes. And oh, by the way, this then leads to that 3rd pillar. By being able to see and have those tools, you then are able to have an understanding of basically a career, and then understanding how the math goes into creating financial literacy, a career that leads to wealth development, that leads to change of your community, that leads to having people inside of your community that can return funds, build things that were part of the dream. And foundationally, in that educational process, we've learned that that 4th pillar is critical in understanding who it is that you are trying to educate. That is health, mental and physical health. Because some people have been previously diagnosed as unable to learn because of something that people had placed them and had been them incorrectly. So in our educational process, we always make sure that there's an assessment of a person's learning methodology, tools, and then if there are any physical limitations. As a combat veteran, and as a person who came out of different communities, growing up. Someone who's heard the firing on the streets, watch people get killed, watch friends get maimed or wounded. I was able to reify or basically see in another way some of those same attributes that we talk about in post-traumatic stress disorder in children. Because anyone that can watch somebody get killed or maimed and appear to be unaffected, they're kidding themselves. If you're unaffected, you're probably a sociopath. And by the way, you're one of the ones that really and truly, I don't really want you on the streets because you don't care about people. So we want to make sure that one, we help those.
Or you went on
General
mute.
Bray, we lost your sound.
Hello?
Yeah, you're back.
Yes, you're back now.
Okay, good. And just to make sure that that we're tracking, if I may, Michael, or tell me where did you hear me talking last? What was I addressing?
We just left, you only lost about 10 seconds. We heard you say that you wanted the sociopaths off the street and you're about to transition them.
So yeah, thank you very much. So yes. So what we're talking about in this process is making sure that one, we make sure that that one, we build people of character. We make sure that one, when we enter this idea of change, we start off by making sure we understand where a person's physical and mental status is. We're making sure that we educate and train them in a way that they view their communities, and more importantly, give them the tools to grow into career paths that allow them to understand, and the tools to understand how they make money and how they create wealth and bring it back to the communities. And all of this is because we understand at a very deeply rooted level where we've been as a nation, but we don't stay there. We don't live in the past of pain. But if you don't recognize it, if you don't acknowledge it, if you don't believe that it exists, what you do is you are dismissive of the impact that it has on the young people today. And by the way, there's enough stuff out there for our young people to feel bad and stay feeling bad. Snoop Dogg said something that I've never taken out of my mind. At some point, you got to get tired of feeling bad. I think what we're doing right now, looking at community change, looking at recognizing the reality, but moving forward is the right way to go. And everything that we do, all the discussions we have on this show is about that. Because you're going to hear lies told. We just left the administration who lived in that space. And I'm not going to stay there, but I think one of the things, this is what Lady Alicia's talking about, is truth. We talked to you about the truth about when slavery ended. We talked about the truth of the fact that we're only in the second generation of change, of legally making every human being a human being. And by the way, if you don't know this, when you hear the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, those things come up, fight them with every fiber in your being, because it is through the vote, it is through the legal representatives of this nation that we will sustain every person having the ability to be an equal person. You change that, if those judges change, you will find that will be the damning part of this nation losing the footing, of keeping this a nation that is still the envy of the world. And by the way, if you don't believe that, you haven't visited, you haven't lived in enough places. Forget the visiting, lived in enough places, and you haven't interfaced with enough of the populations around the world. You know, William and I also are part of a team called the African Diaspora, whereby we recognize that there is a holistic view of people who are of African descent. And while we all in this world are, there are some of us who have the direct impacts that we have to address. Everybody's invited to support, but there's a recognition around this world that this country is a leader of trying to address some of the ills that have infected the world about racial disparity, regardless of what the tint of a person's color may be. So we address those issues. This platform talks about the specifics of trying to get the change of the communities in this country, so that we can change utilizing our laws. And when we get it right in this country, I can promise you two things. One is that the residuals will be felt and can be imparted in other parts of the world where people of different hues can be addressed. We're the country that also is responsible for changing how we view religion. Another place that we've got to make sure that we never lose sight of its impacts, but at the same time, its ability to divide if left unchecked. We have a great nation.
Apologize. If I could just take you back one step before we make a transition. As I said, I am Andrew Williams Jr., and I'm broadcasting from here in Los Angeles. But today being August the 1st, I do want to bring to the world's attention that tomorrow, August 2nd, is the first anniversary of the passage of the United Nations Form for People of African Descent. So, General Bray, while you're speaking about the work that we are doing here in the United States, only a second generation away from not having full citizenship, we also have to look forward in what Paul McDonald would call a scenario motion picture vision to look from the future back to where we are now. We are not isolated in our effort to struggle here in the United States. We are part of a global struggle that has been going on for at least 400 years that was commemorated on August 25th of 1619, with the first recorded arrivals of the Africans from the Kwanzaa River area of Angola into Fort Hampton, Virginia. What's less known is that there were 20 and odd Africans that made up that first cohort, but from that same voyage, 76 more were transported to the country of Bermuda. That is a country that is the closest landmass to what we call our Ma'afa, or our Holocaust, represented by the Middle Passage. So today, my daughter in South Africa has traveled to Guyana. You'll see in my background these photos and images of African royalty who have traveled to Guyana to signify the linkage between the African royals on the continent with those of us in the diaspora, in particular those for the Guyana Reparations Committee that's sponsoring this event. That has relevance to our work here in Los Angeles, as California, as you may know, is the first state that actually set up a team to make a study of what that looks like. But it is the work of Sir Bailey, Michael Rendler, Marcella Oliva, myself, Kenneth Wyrick, and others that are on the ground. So we're here to address that issue I brought up to you several months ago, General Bray, where the United Nations Global Compact, Juneteenth study of 2021, indicated that the USA is failing to deliver on its promises of the Sustainable Development Goals to those that are furthest behind, those of us in the African American, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. So while we're talking about the impact of the continental United States, we have to, I think, take a broader view and recognize that Puerto Rico, for example, Guam, from where Sir Bailey has roots, as well as American Samoa and other USA territories, have as much to do with this success as we do. So that's why I'm encouraging us to think through this from a global perspective, from the standpoint of HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, being our interface with this global effort to focus on UN Habitat Agenda, the new urban agenda for all of us from 2016 to 2036. After all, the Sustainable Development Goals is only the second phase of the Millennium Development Goals kicked off in 2000. That gives us 1,000 years to bring peace on Earth, but it's going to take everyday work to get that done, which is why I uplift Marcela Oliva and her leadership as professor of the Los Angeles State Technical College Architectural and Environmental Department that open the doors to the community as advisors and a think tank to deliver solutions. So today's effort and activity, General Bray, is a continuation of that. And so I look forward to finding ways we can work and network together to continue this journey. Michael Rendler, as General Bray is quiet, perhaps you'd like to make a comment and then we'll move towards close, depending on what your schedule is like.
I'm actually still here real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and make some few comments. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mike so we can close out. But to be fair, thank you very much for making that segue again back to the holistic view. But I want everybody to be clear, especially from my perspective. From my perspective, one is that what we do in this nation does in fact affect others, and I think it's to think of the approach as global is appropriate, but you can only affect what is within you can only directly affect what is within your state and state rules, and you then have to develop a consortium to go forward as a strategist and expert on military operational art and strategic war. One of the key rules is allies. One of the key rules of fighting anything global is allies, but it starts off with leadership. Leadership is the United States' role. That's what we've inherited, and we've inherited not because we are the United States. We've inherited because we are a composite of the world's people. And as I explained once to a young Korean when he was asking me about my nation and being a new nation, I gave him 2 points of departure. First is the reason I was as a soldier on the peninsula of Korea was because I was invited, and we were invited because the world had elevated us. But most importantly, as the United States, we represent and are represented by virtually every nation in the world. And our breakouts, despite there being a minority of people, a majority today of people of not of African or other descent, we have large swaths of other nations, to include places like the largest populations of Jewish people outside of Israel, the largest populations of Czechoslovakians, the large population of people of color outside of the continent of Africa. This is what we do. We are those people. So when we did come up with something that works, it usually is transportable because we have a state document that is based upon people's rights to vote. And even though it has been under attack by a select few, it has withstood, and I think it will withstand. And so that's what makes us different. And it still makes us that place that when some of the leaders of other nations who are our opponents, at the end of the day, they ask for us among the allies to lead that effort. So it is.
However, if I may be so blunt, on April the 4th of 1968, when the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, I was in Macon, Georgia, as a 10-year-old who had been reading since I was 3 years old and reading newspapers around the world, or at least around the country, from this one pharmacist that was right down the street. That pharmacist on that day told me to keep my dirty nigger hands off those books or I'd end up dead like that nigger King. Now, I was confused and I asked my mother, what this meant. She chastised the woman, but we then had to talk. It was then, General Bray, that I learned that I am not just an American citizen. And also I'm not an African because I wasn't born in Africa, but Africa was born in me. But I'm in fact a global citizen because the bloodline that I have runs through all of us. So, you know, there was an article, there was a book in the late 60s talking about the double-mindedness of quote Negroes, in that you had to have one existence that of your own experience, but you had to then, as a result of the talk, you know, be conscious of the ways that others, in this case, white supremacists in the United States, will look at you. But there's a third way that we have to take human responsibility number 29 that was codified in the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 by, of course, the United States in San Francisco, to take human responsibility that it is what I call the IOE, the internet of everything, everyone, everywhere. So I agree with you. We have to start at home, but we have to also not be afraid, as Mariam Anderson was misquoted or quoted by Nelson Mandela, and not be afraid of what we are facing in the future, but afraid of our own power. And our power extends beyond the United States, but we have to incorporate, in my belief, a narrative that includes the entire world in the context of where we are right now. Thank you for your time. If you're speaking, you're muted. If you're not, Michael, the floor is yours.
It is called Socratic thought. And it is exactly what I said. We are in violent agreement. One, the space we own is where we start, but we have to understand that it will have the impact that's broader. Mike, it's yours.
Yeah, I just have one more. I know we want to get out of here, but I just have one more little screen share I'd like to do.
Your time. We have time, so you can be as eloquent as you choose.
Well, we're all impacted with what's happening here, but I wanted to bring this one opportunity. This is Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority. So this is like in Los Angeles, the group we're working with in WAD's called HACLA, Housing Authority, City of Los Angeles. This is a technical specification for work. Okay, this is called an RFP that was just released. It's due on the 8th. But the reason I wanted to bring it up here is because my talk today was data-driven design decision-making, using a technology called the spatial data infrastructure. If I type a search into spatial data infrastructure, the core of Vcap, you won't find the word in here. Okay, all activities pretty much happen somewhere. They're location-based. And the fact that they just released this, and it's talking about a roadmap, a strategic roadmap that includes key milestones to assist to make digital transformation moves that will enhance the agency. So this was my talk today of interoperability, being able to make sure that the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, the EDA, Department of Commerce, all have an integrated, interoperable data model is the core concept called the federated enterprise architecture. And this is the only way to do is with what's called the spatial data infrastructure. And General Bray knows about this. The military has been using it for a long time. So this is in every city in the United States to really make data-driven, informed decisions. You need to get these data back-end systems operating, and you need to have them operating with the front end, the viewer, the public, the participant, the residents, the one section 3 that's supposed to benefit, participatory. And for them to be participatory, they need to have an understanding. That's that pillar of education. And that could change and allow the society as a whole to get to what Andrew's talking about with the United Nations new urban agenda, to start to look at things comprehensively. interactive interdependency. So one of my notes in my other talk I gave earlier was there's nothing in this document in manufacturing that uses the word nature or natural system. And nature and natural system are the core concepts of Vcap. They're the core concepts of what's called natural law. They're the core concepts of us being able to understand science, because science is the investigation of what natural systems means. And so I share this document and I share that concept because I really honestly believe that we need to speak at this level of sophistication when we want to make the transformation model that we're interested in. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I certainly agree 100%. General Bray, any closing thoughts?
Well, because you tapped me one more time, I will just make sure.
Well, you can always ignore me. If you be quiet, I'll just overlook you and keep going. Don't worry.
No problem. Now, one of the things I do want to make sure there's a misnomer in this word urban agenda. I don't know what that means, because you know, when you figure out that almost 80+% of the world's population lives in the littorals, and most states live in some kind of a cluster, the urban agenda means wherever, probably in my mind, there is a cluster of people. I currently live in a small town that by definition is called a small city, but it never will reach the word of urban. And its population is about 60% African American. And unfortunately, that is where most of our nation clusters, but it doesn't all cluster there. But the concerns are all there. And the concerns of the issues that affect these urban centers, where there's an ill law population, it affects the same people that are living outside of some of these places where the farms are failing. They have some of the same interdependent issues associated with, as Mike showed in that last piece of paper, IT. The IT world, the ability to be connected is as bad in those places, to make sure that they're not competing with the farm next door, but the kid from China next door that's in Beijing. They've got to have those same pipelines. They've got to have the interconnectivity of conversation. They've got to even understand how the farm works. They got to understand how their grain gets priced. So while I can agree with that, the urban centers look at the density of human beings, the problems are migratory. And we've got to think that way. We've got to make sure we understand that those things, the world is no longer flat, nor is the world in specific spaces anymore. It really isn't. And so we can use the urban centers as laboratories for information, but let's not kid ourselves that the outside is left out. And I hate to keep coming back to the last administrative leader we had, but he learned this and he utilized the fact that I can win this thing by going outside. So I want to make sure that we do not forget the places that are outside, the people who need us outside of the urban areas, the kids of Appalachia, etc. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave.
Sir. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm going to leave there, but I want to make sure that one, we understand that we can use the labs, but every American counts. Every person in this world counts. And while we will never achieve world peace, people who are not at peace will know that there's somebody fighting for them. That's my thought.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to bring to your attention that just as we're using Vcap, as though our audience understands it, when I use urban, it was in the context of a specific description that includes all human settlements. This is a term used by the United Nations Habitat. So specifically with this quote, new urban agenda is just a title of a book or a handbook that addresses all these issues that you have actually brought up that impact not just, as you say, South Central Los Angeles, but also Appalachia and all places in between, including those refugee settlements of those people that are displaced through climate conflict or otherwise. So I just want to put it in the context that all I'm suggesting is that just as we adapt to new learnings or new experiences, we also, as Michael says, I think it's incumbent upon us to create a Wikipedia-like depository where we can define what words mean. Much like Alice in Wonderland, words mean what you say they mean. But as long as we all have a common understanding of what the meaning is, then I believe we can move forward. Thank you for your time. And with that, unless there are any closing thoughts, we're going to wrap it up for today. This is Andrew Williams Jr. with General Arnold Gordon-Bray and architect Michael Rendler. This is a monthly series on the first Mondays with the General and the Architect, brought to you by Andrew Williams Jr. with the Andrew Networks. We'll be streaming on the AHIABGA-TV through Lady Alicia Hamilton to a worldwide audience. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to you next month.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, General.
Thanks to all.
Hey, thank you all.